afternoon. I'm Jim Bish with Inlet Technology. This course is going to be preserving AutoCAD Revit BIM in Autodesk 3ds Max Design. A little bit of background about myself. I came out of the mechanical engineering world, doing inventor products and things like that, all the mechanical products. And I started working for a dealership who's doing architectural applications, and very quickly turned into interoperability. So what we're going to talk about today in preserving BIM information is interoperability. And we're going to find out how easy it really is to interopt with the products we have and still have a good input without having to recreate anything. So the first thing, we're going to cover preserving BIM information in 3ds Max Design using FBX and a layer strategy for constructing the Max Design scenes from the original Revit-based models. I've also tagged this, we're going to explore the application and editing of imported materials and showing them in the viewports, but that's kind of been taken care of now because the FBX 2011.3 actually fixed that problem. So the only thing you really have to do now is to go in and turn image-based. You just turn it on in the viewport and it comes in just fine now. Before you had to recreate them. So we'll have a little bit of light discussion about that. We won't go in depth on it. I'm also using, in the IES Lighting, the whole reason I went with an FBX workflow versus using the AutoCAD workflow is because, I mean, they're both great workflows, but I'm not a lighting engineer, so when it comes to lighting, I really want to preserve what's coming out of the Revit-based models because that's what the lighting engineers are telling me the lighting needs to be. So that's why we're using the FBX workflow for this. I use containers mainly. You know, everybody knows if you get into the CG side of things that lots of polygons take lots of time to render. Okay, so what we're doing here is I'm actually offloading a lot of the unnecessary lighting that I don't need for the particular scene that we're storyboarding just to get rid of it and get it out of the scene. And it's taken my render time from, I mean, this is not an exaggeration, somewhere in the neighborhood of 8 hours to render a frame down to 9 minutes by containering off all the things we're not really using in the scene. So it's pretty significant in that workflow. Okay, so the first thing I did in the scene was I wanted to preserve what we do in the architectural world, and that means each discipline works on their own models. Okay, so we set up a team of Studio Max people for visualization, and we gave them a discipline. We have one handling architectural, one handling MEP, one for structural, and one for doing the civil engineering. So because of that, you can see that this is just a screen cap of the scene, the XREF scenes dialog inside of Max. And you can see that I have an architectural model, an MEP model, a site model, and a structural model. Now, the only thing, you know, there's a lot of different workflows on the XREF strategy, too. I just picked the XREF scene strategy because it locks me into sending someone to a specific scene to make a specific edit. So if it's on the architectural level, they have to open that scene and edit it. So I've kind of split everybody down into discipline specific so I can manage their work as well. Okay, so I'll show you what that looks like. In this model, if we go in and take a look, now this model is 17,000 square feet. Okay, now I'm probably running a little bit of inferior equipment against this model. This model will take in excess of 7 gigs of RAM to manipulate adequately in a workflow. Okay, so now when you're doing BIM inside of Max, you're really looking at some overhead here. Now, we don't have the multi-threading yet until we hit the render button. So sometimes you get you get processor limited before you get memory limited when you run these applications. So you really got to pick and choose what equipment you run this on if you're trying to do BIM in Max as a whole building. Again, this is only 17,000 square feet and it's consuming 7.8 gigs of RAM when I operate it. Okay? So in this model you can see here that what I've done in that XREF scheme, if we go into manage our XREFs, you can see the screen cap that was in the PowerPoint here for architectural, MEP, site, and structural. Now, the only thing that's actually in this master model is the lighting. That way I can very quickly pick a light. Now, I also have a container in here just to show you what that is. But you can see that because I've picked this XREF scene workflow, nothing is selectable because it's all an XREF. So I can very quickly pick through the lights that I have storyboarded for this scene, okay, without having to worry about picking other things in the background. So that was one thing that really gave a benefit out of doing that workflow, even though I have to go back to the individual max files to edit each individual piece of a scene. Okay, so next thing we got here, excuse me, I'm on the wrong screen here. The next thing we did was we did an FBX export for each Revit category. And that was very painstaking to do because it was a lot of data through 4 different models. But what we came out with, this is a visibility and graphics window that you get when you issue the command in Revit. And you can see all the different category names here. I took each one of these categories individually and gave them their own FBX export. And when we bring that back into Max, and I'll show you what that looks like, what I did was I created a layer that was the same name as the category name to import that FBX information on. Okay? So you can see that right now my layer management inside of Max looks very similar to what you see in the visibility and graphics window inside of Revit. Okay? Not only that, it gave me the advantage of being able to set up everything to be manipulated, and you can see it right here in this line, by layer. So I can individually go into each object and change it back to by object to manipulate it at the object level. But this is like a CAD workflow now. I can turn layers on and off in storyboard scenes just like I would in any AutoCAD-based product. So that was the advantage of doing each category individually. Now, there are a couple places where I did split off into different categories where I needed to storyboard some lightings. For instance, I needed the second floor conference room, so I split those off into their own layer. And I did things like that to break the model up, but I did that after the fact. Okay? So that's what it looks like in Max, and wherever you can, it's a good idea to get this down to where on the front end, you're manipulating by layer. Later on, when you start isolating things, you are going to change it back to by object for the properties and everything. But on the front end, I like to keep it at the layer level to keep it simple. Okay? So the next thing we want to look at here is once we got into Revit, or got out of Revit into Max, we imported the categories onto similarly named layers, which is what I just showed you here. And that's what the screen cap for that looks like. The next thing we do with that is we use the layer control to duplicate the visibility and graphics in the model. Okay? So let's get back into that model. Okay. Now, in this model right here, to just take that one step further, another advantage of putting this on a layer mechanism is because I can control based on the storyboard of what kind of shot I'm trying to get. Now, keep in mind, this is architectural visualization. We're doing frame by frames here. We're storyboarding a shot and we're rendering it for a marketing piece or something to that effect. We're not doing a whole bunch of animation in this workflow here. We could do that, but right now what I did was based on the storyboard, we can tell what layers are going to contribute to the radiosity. If you don't see it, it doesn't need to contribute, right? Okay, so that's the way we're going to handle that, is we just turn the radiosity on for what's going to actually contribute to the scene. Same way with renderability. I don't think I have them set that way right now, but I could have turned a lot of this, I mean, if it's off, it's off, but I could have turned the rendering capabilities off on a lot of these categories as well to trim that down a little bit. Now, another thing you want to know about preserving the BIM is because we use this FBX mechanism, not only do we get the exact naming convention on all of our different categories and the components inside those categories, we also get the element IDs. So anything that changes in that model can be cross-referenced directly to an element ID. Okay, that workflow kind of works in AutoCAD, but it's not like this. I mean, this is exact the way it came out of the Revit model. AutoCAD, you will get the entity IDs out of it, but they don't present themselves directly on the naming conventions. You have to dig for those properties when you do that kind of workflow. Okay, so that was another advantage of using the FBX. Now, I want to talk a little bit about what we've got going on in the notes as well, because this is not a conventional class where I just went through and duplicated what we talk about in the classroom here. What I did was I gave you, like I said, I am not from the CG world. Okay, I'm from mechanical engineering and architecture, right? So my number one rule is interoperability, don't recreate anything. And a lot of the Max workflow, you see people out there just recreating one room to get a scene. I don't do it. I use the model for everything. Okay? So what I gave you was when the dealership asked me to take on Max, I told them that I would take it on under one condition. And that condition was that we did it in the context of BIM. Okay? So that meant we had to validate the product and the equipment to run it on so that we can consult customers properly. And what I gave you in the course outline is virtually everything that I looked at in making that happen. Okay? So we go down through what the initial Max settings are, and if I can get this to a single page, we'd probably be better off here. Just plus it up, it'll do it. I don't know why that's coming out two-sided. But anyway, let's walk down through these settings a little bit. We have our initial Max settings. And what you're going to be surprised about here is we manipulated very, very little of anything. We wanted this to be, very simple, get up and running, hold BIM in a project, preserve all the BIM information in Revit with minimal pain. Okay? So you can see that we're using a design viz mental ray for our custom UI, which is the default. Our system units are still 1 unit is an inch. That's a default. Now, we could have set that to feet just to get Max not to have to translate the data going from feet to inches, but it's really not that important because it does that well, and it does it fast enough where you're not going to see it in the background anyway. So we didn't bother varying that. We could have set that to feet up there for the system units. And our units set up as feet with fractional inches. We're basically just matching the same settings that we have in Revit here. Okay? Now on the General tab, we have layer defaults for unchecked default to by layer for new nodes. Now I just told you I want you to try and use on the front end everything by layer, but now I'm telling you to turn that off as things come in. It's much easier to organize things on the layer first and then set everything to by layer. It's a much better workflow that when you pick an object and right-click and go to the properties window on it, you definitely want to see the properties without turning off a switch to open up the values to edit them. Okay? And people new to this workflow will appreciate that. So by default, you can just leave it unchecked default to by layer. You want it to come in by object so that as soon as you go into the properties window, you're manipulating the properties of that object. We can organize the layers after the fact. The next thing we looked at was we're going to use real-world texture coordinates because they're already pre-configured in the Autodesk libraries. The new libraries in 2011 are central libraries under a common shared location. And they're used by every product in the architectural realm. So those standard libraries are where I'm pulling all my image base from. If it was in Revit, I can duplicate it in Max. It's that simple. And coming out of 2011.3, The only thing you have to do is go in and show the image in the viewpoint to get it to show up. It used to make this, it was an ADES bitmap, and it would use a generic name for the image. And you had to go in and reconstruct that to actually find the materials. And another issue before the 2011.3 of that FBX was the IES Lighting was being put in your temp directory in Windows. And if you deleted or cleaned out your temp directory, you'd lose all your lighting and you'd have to re-import it all. So that was also fixed in the 2011.3, and it works very well now. So now you're getting FBM directories built underneath your FBX directory, and it's holding all the information properly the way it should. So that was a couple of the pieces that I wanted to go over, was how I was fixing that, but Autodesk fixed it for us. Isn't that nice? Mouse control. I always put this check zoom about mouse point in orthographic and projection on. That is not a default setting. You have to actually turn those on. And the reason I do that is because it gives me that CAD convention and the CAD feel back into the Macs when I zoom and pan around. It's a lot more like the CAD applications that we're used to. Okay. Okay, in here now we're starting to look at Revit. And again, you're going to see that we have touched on very, very little of any of the settings out of the box. This is usable out of the box. Our length is set to feet and fractional inches. I always keep things on a detail level fine. And I don't know that it affects Macs because I never really tested to see that. But it does affect programs like Navisworks. If you're not in fine detail on some of the MEP geometry, what ends up happening is it goes down to single line, and if you have line work turned on or turned off, you don't see it. So I always make sure I go into a fine detail no matter what, and that's just a workflow between multiple products, not just for Macs and Revit. So that's the way I like to handle it. I just tell people, make sure you're in fine detail just to make sure. Now, there are some places you don't want to do that. You're not going to want to go into fine detail on that architectural model. The reason I say that is because you're actually creating more polygons if you do that, and you want to keep it smaller. You probably end up having to do that mainly. You don't need it for the structural work, you don't need it for the architecture, but you will need it for some of the MEP work. Okay? So that's where you would use that fine detail level just to make sure. And it just comes from what I've seen in Navisworks where things minimize themselves to line geometry. Okay? Now the next thing we looked at here was, okay, we have preference settings for that. The real-world textures, because that's the way Revit uses them. Okay, our length settings, the default units are feet with fractional inches in Revit. So that's also what we used when we went into, and I showed you the max settings. We set those units to be the same. Okay, and the next panel, it says create and delete layers. Now, I did this one by one as I exported and imported. So I had a session of Revit open, and I'd isolate one category, and I'd do an FBX export, and I'd name it so that I knew what it was, you know, which file it came out of. Basically, I did it by discipline and category name, so like architectural doors. So I had all those FBX files transferred out, and I'd come in and make the appropriate layer inside the layer manager in Max, and then I'd import that FBX information and merge it into the scene. Okay, so I've named the layers similar to Revit category names. And the reason I say similar is there are instances where after I start storyboarding that I really need to refine what's on what layer. So at that point I start breaking them down further. Okay? In your notes again, you have whenever possible, control the settings at the layer level. So like I said, initially you want to bring them in by object, but once you isolate things onto their layers, that's when you should start thinking about, okay, let's set it to by layer, get them on the layer, set them all to by layer, and then as you need to individually manipulate an object, that's when you would go back to by object on the properties. This way you can turn layers on and off and handle it just like a CAD workflow. Down here in the notes, I've already talked about this. FBX import 2011.3.1. And this was actually a quote. This bullet item here was a quote from Ken Pimentel, who's the product manager for 3ds Max. It says, this is what was out on the area. It says, when importing 2011 into Max, the FBM folders were no longer being created. Now with the .3 release, the FBM folder is created. Once the file is imported into Max, the folder will be placed in the same location as the FBX file that's being imported, and it contains your textures, your IES, XML, and mental imagery that were embedded during the discovery conclusion of the defect or fix. And it gives you a link to read the verbiage on that. That is what fixed the random naming of the images and the fact that your IES files were being put in a temp directory. So that's all fixed now, and it works beautifully. So that's just another load taken off of you that used to contribute to the workflow. Let me get back up here. Sorry about that. Okay, cameras in here. It says the cameras, only the camera corresponding to the 3D active view is exported from Revit. Okay, so when they tell you it supports cameras, it does, but only the active camera. So when you want to do, what I normally do is I go through and figure out what cameras contribute to my storyboarding. Okay, and I will activate one of those cameras as I go through at least one of the categories to bring that camera in. And if I'm not using them, I never activate them, then it won't bring them in. So I tell people to switch your camera, storyboard your shots, pick which cameras you need, and then while you're doing your category exports out of Revit, just activate that camera, and it'll come with it. Okay? Now, the sun and sky, you have to hide that after you export once for the scene, because every time you try and, if you go in and export category by category, you're going to repeat that sun and sky over and over and over again. So you got to make sure you only export that once. Okay? Let's go back through this a little more. Here's a couple more notes that I highlighted in this workflow. Okay? Right here it says turn off the renderability for layers that are not visible in the current view, and turn off the radiosity for layers that don't significantly contribute to the scene. Okay? Because you're saving yourself render time there. Nobody likes to wait overnight for a rendering just to find out they still have tweaks to do on it. Okay? That just adds to the expense. All right, let's see what else we have. The smoothing groups, this is another one that I don't have highlighted right here, but I should. You want those, they are unchecked by default, and you definitely want them unchecked because they will try and smooth walls into like round corners in some places, and it gives you a really weird effect sometimes on how something renders. It doesn't render flat and shaded into a corner properly. So you definitely want that. Use that selectively only when you need it. And if you do need smoothing groups on the way in, I would do those objects by themselves. Other than that, I would just wait till they came into Max and put their smoothing on them as you need them then. Animations, we're not bringing in. The cameras are checked by default, but again, you're only getting the one that's active when you do the FBX transport. So you got to handle those individually. Now, another thing is the lights. I will bring in some lamps and, light fixtures that are put in by the architects, but mainly I like to stick to the MEP engineer's lighting. When I bring those lights in, Initially, I will put them on their own layer coming out of the MEP model when I do the transport. But eventually, I like putting all that, the sun and the sky and the lights on layer 0, so I know exactly where they're at, so I can very easily go get all those. And they are in the master scene. They're not nested into one of the XREFs. That way, they're really easy to grab a hold of when you go to manipulate something in the scene. Because let's face it, this model right now is set up for visualization, and I don't need to be tweaking materials. If I do, I go back to the masters. I need to be tweaking lighting and camera right now. Okay? So I'd like to handle those lights a little bit differently than the rest of the workflow. Containers, this is huge. When I storyboarded this shot, I probably used about 15 to 20 lights that I needed to storyboard a night shot looking at the front of this building. Okay? There's hundreds of lights in here. And every time you put lighting in, your render time goes up exponentially. So what I did was I give you an example here. I'll show you how it works in the model itself. What we did in the model was our MEP light fixtures, if I can find those right here. These lighting fixtures right here, this layer, you can see right now that it's empty. That's because what I've done is I've split all the lighting I needed off into subcategorized layers, like lighting for the second floor conference room, lighting in the second floor lounge. So I isolated the ones that I'm using for the storyboard, and then I containered the rest of the MEP light fixtures here. So I have this container right out here just to show you an example of that. I only did one container just to show the example. And what we can do with the containers, if we go back and we say load that container, you'll see it populate underneath these MEP lighting devices. And now, lighting fixtures, I'm sorry. All these lights right here you see in that subcategorized list have been offloaded because they're not necessary for the rendering. Just imagine what the render time is. If you figure lighting increases your render time exponentially, think about that 8 hours versus 9 minutes. And I actually did do those timings to time this. The whole model took me 9 hours to render. Just offloading the lighting that I wasn't used to and backing back down to a draft mode render of this thing was 9 minutes. So 1/10 the time just by offloading the unused lighting fixtures. So you really, really have to organize. That's why I like organizing these models like CAD, because everybody knows that CAD workflow and how to take things out of the model and how to not show things that way. And if you use that philosophy, it goes a whole lot better. Okay? Now, a lot of the CG artists out there would disagree with me, where they would want to take just basic geometry and do everything freeform. And, more power to them. But I'm consulting people that are doing this in-house in their architectural departments. They've tasked someone with coming up with these shots because it's so expensive to outsource it. Now they want to do it in-house. And this is the way to do it in-house because you need a little bit more equipment to do it, but it's the CAD convention that everybody's used to. I mean, a little bit of that even applies all the way back into Revit. Not too much of it because it's a BIM workflow, but if anybody was on AutoCAD architecture sees a pretty easy time moving into Revit other than the constraints. So that was the benefit of actually taking that container offline. And for some reason, it's not reporting the polygon count here. But I can tell you that polygon count was somewhere in the neighborhood of 70,000 before I offloaded those lights. Now it's down to 20,000. Okay? So that was a significant offload. And that's just lighting. I didn't take anything else out of the model. No structural work, nothing. Which would be the next step for me to get the render times down a little further. I'd probably go ahead and look at the structural model and what wasn't contributing to the scene. Because you got all these wraps around your columns, you can take the columns out. If you don't see the footings, you can take them out. So we can take out a lot of information and can just container it off temporarily while we're waiting for that render times. So let me go ahead and unload that so you can see that come back out again. Unload container. Now all those lights and the lighting fixtures went away and they're out of the model now. So they're not being processed in the rendering. Okay. So the thing to do here is you want to storyboard your renderings to include the materials, the lighting, the time of day, the exposure, the backgrounds, and everything else. Okay? Then you're going to container off all the unnecessary lighting and, by the way, geometry as well. Just like we just talked about with the structural model. If you don't see it and it's not contributing, it can go away. You can container it off. Okay? Then you're going to render your required images. And that gets you through that part of the PowerPoint of what the workflow is. So back to the class handout, let's see what else I put in here. Like I said, I put in here everything I had to touch to effectively do rendering at the architectural level. Some of the other things I ran into is in the image scaling, if you use the real-world scaling, when you do the exports and imports, no manipulation other than turning them on in the viewports is required so long as your units are proper on the front end. Turning the real-world scaling off, you can manually manipulate and scale things. Okay, so if you have a one-off image that's not scaled properly, you can still turn off the scaling on that particular material and manually scale it yourself. UVW, the transform modifier, that was for tiling and offset in the existing UVW coordinates. There was a lot of times when things weren't coming in properly. They were twisted 90 degrees out or something like that. I don't know what caused it, but I ended up having to use a lot of UVW transforms. A little bit of unwrapping here and there to get certain things. Everybody knows what the unwrapping is for. It's for actually mapping graphics onto an object. Now, creating backgrounds. This model, I didn't do a whole lot of this because my site was enough to cover the scene that I was rendering for this. But you have cylindrical backgrounds, spherical backgrounds, and then environment channel backgrounds. This one, I'm using an environment channel background. And what I did with Mental Ray was a technique that I put a haze cloud bitmap. It's in the haze channel for this. I can show you what that would look like right here. You can see that I'm not inheriting from, and this custom doesn't need to be on either. I don't inherit from Mental Ray Sky. I have an override in the haze channel. The haze is turned up to 2. I have this night shot in here on the haze channel, and I've bumped that up a little bit to get the effect on the rendering. And I can show you what those renderings are looking like. Let's see, other than rendering it, that would take 10 minutes. So let's just go ahead and find the one I saved for you here. And that's going to be on, let's see. I should have opened this before I started, but I forgot about it. I believe it's this one. And we can go higher on that. So what this is real-world lighting. Okay, 4 o'clock in the morning, East Coast. I'm in Virginia Beach. I had to tone down the lighting on the floor down to 50%, but it is attenuating. So it's following the inverse square laws for all the lighting decay and everything like that. And I had the MEP engineer put some uplighting in the front of the building for me. You can't see the fixtures because they're kind of recessed into the concrete, but they're there. I just didn't have a chance to have him fine-tune that for me, but you could see the uplighting on the columns in there. And there's parking lot lights going all the way around. And the effect on the background is just from the sun rising. There was nothing done to that. So you've got this little bit of haze going on at about 20% at a certain distance. I don't even remember what distance I set it for, but you'd see it coming out, especially in the lighting underneath the roof here. You can see the haze in those lights pretty easily. So that's what it looks like if you storyboard the shot. That render right there, with everything offloaded properly, is 10 minutes work. Okay, now that's in draft mode. Once you go for that marketing shot and you refine everything, you can see I got some roofing issues up there on that tin roofing for scaling of the bitmaps. So after that, you figure out how much you can offload, get your shot right, and like I said, this is a draft mode shot right here. Just imagine what would happen if I cranked up the resolution on this for the real marketing shot. It would look pretty good. So I was happy with the way that came out, and I kind of passed that on to marketing and said, here it is, tell me what you want next. And then we started doing interior, exterior shots. And that was another thing I put in the notes as a general rule of thumb. The one thing about, even though Revit has mental ray in it, we always have problems where we do an interior, exterior shot where the sunlight coming in through the glass just washes out the rendering. And by the time you adjust exposure control, you've made the image so grainy it's unusable. Okay, so that's just it's not that Revit is inferior because it's using the same rendering package. What it is there's no control to get to it. So I always tell people that when you're doing an exterior shot, your white balance should be 6,500. And that's what it is coming out of the box, too. So you shouldn't even have to set anything. But when you go for an interior-exterior scene, you should divide that in half at the starting point, down to 3,200, and see what comes up in your environment outside the glass. And it should also solve the problem where it's washing out all the color inside the building as well. So that's a white balance setting you want to look at there. Also, another technique that you can use for that is a combination of a photon and a final gather solution that would also solve that problem. Okay, so I think that pretty well covers. The rest of this is just my general notes of what you should be looking for. This is a good compilation of notes because if you read these notes, you will really see what you got to look at to get a handle on architectural visualization if you're not experienced in it. And believe me, when I came into this, I had zero experience with Max, other than to plug a couple things in and check them out and play with some surface normals and a little bit of materials and things like that. But this is an extensive list of everything. Another good resource for this, and I have it in the back. Let me get down there so you can see it here. I put in here for reference material this 3ds Max 2009 Architectural Visualization, Intermediate to Advanced. This is put out by Brian L. Smith with 3D-ATS. I actually had the pleasure of going down there and taking that course in Miami with him. And chapters 11 through 14, if you read nothing else in that book, you definitely have to read those chapters because they put you right on the mark with doing the mental ray stuff and understanding what you're doing. So you're not just poking in the dark out there. And that's another problem I've seen with the architectural people. We are very used to seeing units, defined units for us, okay? And that's not so with Max. Like sometimes you'll get a setting that says, okay, the settings for this are -5 to +5. And what does that mean? Percent? Does that mean inches? Does that mean feet? We don't know. So if you read these chapters 11 through 14, you'll get a good handle on the way that all those settings flow together and what they are. So I would definitely recommend you pick up and find a reference to that book and read those chapters if you're getting into the architectural visualization. Well, I think that's about it for coverage. I thank you for attending. You have a good day.